Itasca Pine Flat, Minnesota, September 1884. The air held the first clean, sharp edge of autumn, a promise of what was to come. While other settlers were chinking their square-notched log cabins, stuffing mud and moss into the gaps against the coming cold, Toivo Lehtinen was doing something else entirely, something strange. On a cleared patch of ground, he was not building up but bending over. 30 green oak poles, each nearly 40 feet long and thick as a man's thigh, lay soaking in the creek. One by one, he and his young son, Elias, would drag a pole out, position it over a low wooden form, and with a system of ropes and levers, slowly, painstakingly, bend the green wood into a perfect arch. The work was slow, quiet, and drew a crowd. Royden Pickersgill, the timber cruiser for the logging company, stopped his horse one afternoon, watching with a professional's critical eye. He was a man who understood wood in terms of board feet and tensile strength, a man whose calculations determined the profit or loss of a whole season. He saw only foolishness. "What in God's name is that Finn building?" he asked Jedediah Stone, who was hauling firewood nearby. "A 70-foot caterpillar?" Stone spat a stream of tobacco juice. "Beats me. He calls it a house. Says it'll be warmer than ours." Pickersgill laughed, a short, sharp bark of a sound. "Warmer? That thing's a death trap. Those green poles hold tension like a drawn bow. Come January, when the frost gets deep in the grain, they'll get brittle. One of them will snap, and the whole damn thing will spring open in the middle of the night." Dump 70 feet of bark and 1,000 pounds of snow on his family while they sleep. He rode closer, addressing Toivo directly. "Lehtinen, you're putting your wife and children in a coffin. That arch won't hold past the first hard freeze." Toivo paused, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of his hand. He looked at the half-finished skeleton of his home, a series of pale green ribs against the dark pines. He looked at Pickersgill, a man of authority and experience. "It will hold," he said, his voice calm and low. Then he turned back to his work, leaving the timber cruiser frowning in his wake. The word spread through the small settlement. The crazy Finn was building a bentwood coffin for his family. It was not a question of if it would fail, but when. What did this Karelian Finnish kilo-pyrti builder understand about vapor sealing that seasoned timber cruisers and frontier carpenters had missed? This channel is dedicated to the lost wisdom of the builders and innovators who solved impossible problems with the materials at hand. Their stories are not just history, they are lessons in physics, ingenuity, and resilience. If you believe this kind of knowledge deserves to be remembered, take a moment to subscribe to our channel and click the notification bell. I promise that by the end of this story, you will understand the profound science behind why a wall of bark and moss could outperform 4-foot-thick stone. Let me know in the comments, what's the most unconventional house you've ever seen? Toivo Lehtinen was not a carpenter. He had never notched a log in his life, not in the way these Minnesotans did, with their precise saddle notches and dovetail corners. In the old country near Vyborg, he had been a different kind of builder. He was a man who understood the skin of things. He understood the tight, waterproof peel of birch bark, harvested in great sheets at precisely the right moment in spring. He understood the fibrous, insulating mat of sphagnum moss, gathered from the bogs and dried for a year until it was a feather-light sponge. His trade was building the traditional Karelian long cabins, the kilo-pyrti, structures meant to endure winters that made Minnesota's seem forgiving. His specialty was not the logs themselves, but the cladding, the outer membrane that sealed the great timbers from the devastating cycle of freeze and thaw that could shatter wood like glass. He had come to America with his wife, Ino, and their 2 small children, Elias and Sophia, drawn by the promise of land and towering forests. But their first winter in a hastily built, standard-issue cabin on the Itasca Flat had been a lesson in a new kind of cold. It was a dry, piercing cold that seemed to defy fire itself. He remembered the lamp wick, freezing stiff even while the flame was still burning, the flame shrinking to a tiny blue bead atop a column of ice. He remembered Aino's sharp cry when a frozen cotton shirt, pulled from the line inside their cabin, snapped at the shoulder seam like a dry twig. He remembered trying to make a small repair and watching a nail, pulled from a board, crack the pine it came out of, the wood suddenly as brittle as porcelain. That winter, they were never warm. They burned through 12 cords of wood, a monstrous amount, yet the cold laid its hand on everything. Frost grew in crystalline ferns on the inside of the walls, an inch thick. A bucket of water left 10 feet from the roaring stove would have a skin of ice on it by morning. They survived, but Toivo knew they wouldn't survive another winter like that. The problem wasn't the fire. The problem was the house itself. It leaked heat like a sieve, and he knew why. The conventional failure of the frontier log cabin was not a failure of materials. The massive pine and oak logs were titans of insulation, dense and strong. The failure was a failure of physics, specifically the physics of moisture. Every day, a family of 4 releases gallons of water vapor into the air from breathing, cooking, washing. In a tightly sealed modern home, this is handled by ventilation. In a drafty frontier cabin, it had a far more sinister effect. That warm, moist air would migrate towards the cold outer walls. It would pass through the inner surface of the logs and hit the chinking, the mixture of mud, moss, and grass stuffed between them. There, in that colder zone, the water vapor would condense, turning back into liquid water. As the temperature dropped further, that liquid water would freeze. Ice has 0 insulating value. Worse, the expansion of the ice would break the seal, creating tiny new gaps. The moss in the chinking, which was a brilliant insulator when dry, became a frozen, conductive bridge for the cold. The cabin wasn't just losing heat through drafts, its own walls were actively sucking the warmth out of the air. Furthermore, the rigid, right-angled construction was its own enemy. The square-notched corners, no matter how skillfully cut, were points of immense stress. As the different logs swelled and shrank with the wild temperature swings, these joints were where the frost canches concentrated its power. The subtle heave of the frozen ground and the immense weight of the snow load would find the weakest points, and those were always the corners. Hairline cracks would appear, invisible in autumn, but wide enough by February to slide a knife blade into. The settlers fought this constant decay with a bigger fire, burning more wood to compensate for a house that was actively destroying itself from the inside out. Toivo saw his neighbors, the McCluskeys and the German family, the Schmidts, engaged in a losing battle. Their woodpiles, which seemed enormous in October, were half gone by Christmas. He saw the exhaustion in their faces, the endless, grueling work of feeding a fire that could never quite win. He knew he had to build something different. Not a box to fight the cold, but a vessel to ride it out. The construction of the 70-foot vault was a spectacle of quiet, methodical labor. After bending all 30 green oak poles into their semicircular arches, he let them set for 2 weeks, tied securely in their curved shape. Then he raised them. With Aino and Elias helping to guide the bases, he used a simple gin pole and tackle to hoist each 400-pound arch into place, setting the ends on a low sill of flat stones. The result was a long, ribbed skeleton, like the hull of an overturned Viking ship, 70 feet long and 15 feet high at its apex. Royden Pickersgill made it a point to ride by every few days, often with other men from the logging camp. His warnings became more specific, more technical. "You see that, boys?" he'd say, pointing. "He's lashing the apexes with rope. Rope! That hemp will stretch and shrink with the damp, then it'll freeze solid. There's over 10,000 pounds of tension in that roof frame. When the first big snow load hits, those lashings will groan, and then they'll go. It's not professional. It's not safe. Toivo ignored him. He was not using rope. He was using thin strips of soaked birch bark, which he wrapped around the joints. When the bark dried, it would shrink and tighten into a bond as hard and waterproof as iron. It was an ancient technique, one he'd learned from his grandfather. Next came the skin. From a stand of paper birch deep in the woods, a place he had marked in the spring, he began to harvest the bark. This was not the papery outer bark that peeled in small curls. This was the thick, leathery main bark, taken from the trees in enormous sheets, 6 feet long and 3 feet wide. He worked with surgical precision, making a single vertical cut, and then using a wooden wedge to carefully, slowly peel the skin from the living tree, a process that, if done correctly, did not kill it. He started on the inside of the arched frame, lashing the huge, pale sheets of bark to the oak poles, overlapping them like giant shingles. The interior of the structure was transformed into a smooth, white, continuous tunnel. His wife, Aino, stood inside, her voice echoing slightly in the long space. "It looks like a great sleeping beast, Toivo," she said, a hint of wonder in her voice. "I hope it does not wake." "It will keep us safe," he replied, his voice muffled as he worked on the outside. Now came the most crucial part, the insulation. For months he had been gathering sphagnum moss from a nearby bog, laying it out on racks to dry in the sun and wind. It was now impossibly light and fluffy, holding millions of tiny air pockets. He began packing it into the 8-inch space between the inner bark skin and where the outer skin would go. He packed it thick and dense, a continuous, seamless blanket of insulation covering the entire 70-foot length of the vault. There were no gaps, no seams, no thermal bridges for the heat to escape. Finally, he applied the outer skin, another complete layer of thick birch bark, but this time with the white side facing in towards the moss, and the darker, rougher side facing out. This layer was overlapped in the opposite direction, ensuring that no seam aligned with a seam on the inner layer. He sealed the final overlaps with pine pitch. When he was done, the structure was no longer a skeleton. It was a long, low, dark mound on the landscape, like a natural hillock or the back of a whale. It had no sharp corners, no eaves, no gables. It had only a smooth, curved surface designed to shed wind and snow and to hold its breath against the winter. Pickersgill's final visit came as Toivo was fitting a small door and 2 tiny, skin-covered windows at one end. The timber cruiser shook his head, his face a mixture of pity and professional disdain. "You've buried your family alive, Lehtinen. That moss is going to soak up moisture from the air, from your breathing, and it'll turn into a solid block of ice by midwinter. You've built yourself an ice house. I give you credit for the labor, but the principle is dead wrong. You've got to let a house breathe." Toivo looked at the man, then at his finished home. He simply said, "The tree does not breathe through its skin." The physics of Toivo's barrel vault home was a masterclass in thermal dynamics, a perfect solution born not from textbooks, but from generations of observation. The core principle was something modern building science would not formalize for another century: the absolute necessity of a continuous, impermeable vapor barrier on the warm side of the insulation. Let's break it down. The enemy, as we've established, was moisture. A standard log cabin was a battlefield where warm, moist interior air fought a losing war against the cold outside. The chinking was the front line, and it always failed because it became saturated and froze. Toivo's design refused to fight this battle. It prevented the moisture from ever reaching the insulation in the first place. The inner layer of birch bark was the key. Birch bark is one of nature's most perfect materials. It is rich in a waxy, oily substance called suberin, which makes it incredibly waterproof. It is, in modern terms, a near-perfect vapor barrier. The thousands of gallons of water vapor produced by the Lehtinen family inside the cabin would hit this inner skin and simply stop. It could not pass through into the moss. The vapor pressure would equalize, and the moisture would remain as vapor within the living space, creating a slightly more humid, and therefore more comfortable, environment. This single fact had an enormous cascading effect. Because the 8 inches of sphagnum moss remained bone dry all winter, it could perform at its peak insulating capacity. Dry moss is essentially trapped air, one of the best insulators on the planet. Its R value, a measure of thermal resistance, is exceptionally high. But wet, frozen moss is a conductor. By keeping the insulation perfectly dry, Toivo was achieving an effective R value perhaps 4 to 5 times greater than that of his neighbor's frozen, compromised chinking. We can quantify this. A typical log wall with frozen chinking might have an effective R value of R5 or R6. Toivo's 8-inch wall of dry moss, protected by its bark skins, was likely performing at R25 or even R30, a value that would be respectable in a modern code-built home. The structure's shape was also a critical component. Heat is lost through 3 methods: conduction, direct transfer, convection, air movement, and radiation, infrared waves. The thick, dry moss stopped conduction. The airtight bark skin stopped convection. There were no drafts. The curved interior surface even helped with radiation, reflecting heat back towards the center of the room more effectively than flat walls and sharp corners. Furthermore, the arch was structurally brilliant. A square corner is a point of weakness where thermal stresses concentrate. An arch, however, distributes those stresses evenly across its entire length. As the ground froze and heaved, the vault could flex and move slightly without cracking a single seam. It was a living structure, not a rigid box. Pickersgill's prediction of a catastrophic failure was based on his understanding of timber, of rigid, jointed beams. He did not understand the physics of a monolithic, flexible shell. Toivo hadn't built a collection of parts, he had built a single, integrated system. That winter, the sky turned a hard, brilliant, merciless cobalt. A polar air mass descended upon northern Minnesota and did not leave. For 16 consecutive nights, the thermometer outside the trading post registered below minus 38 degrees Fahrenheit. On the calmest nights, it touched minus 45. There was no snow, no fog, just the profound, silent cold of the upper atmosphere touching the earth. Every twig on every tree became clad in a thick layer of frost spikes, intricate crystals of frozen air. The world looked like it was made of glass. Inside the square cabins of the settlement, life became a grim cycle of stoking and shivering. The cold was a physical presence. It poured through the walls. It radiated from the floors. The McCluskey family moved all their beds into the single room with the stove, sleeping in a huddled pile under every blanket they owned. Marcus Thorne, a bachelor who ran a trap line, found his bucket of mop water had frozen into a solid halo on the floor around the spot where he'd left it, just inside his own door. The sound of the season was the constant, frantic chopping of wood and the sharp, gunshot-like crack of trees in the forest, their sap freezing and splitting the trunks. Inside Toivo Lehtinen's long, curved home, there was quiet. A single, small stove, less than half the size of his neighbor's, glowed with a gentle, steady heat. Toivo burned a fraction of the wood. The 70-foot-long space was a consistent temperature throughout. It was an unbelievable 62 degrees. The numerical contrast was stark, 100 degrees warmer than the air just 9 inches away through a wall of bark and moss. But the true difference was in the quality of life. The image of their survival was not one of dramatic endurance, but of profound normalcy. One evening, little Sophia dropped her woolen mitten on the floor near the door, the area that in any other cabin would be a zone of intense cold. She forgot about it until the next morning. When Ino found it, it was not a stiff frost-covered board. It was soft and pliable. She picked it up and handed it back to her daughter, who put it on. That was the victory. The air inside was so stable and dry that Ino could do her fine mending work without her fingers growing numb. The smell of rising bread dough filled one end of the cabin, the yeast alive and active in the gentle, pervasive warmth. They were not surviving. They were living. Outside, the world of glass glittered under the cold sun. Inside, life went on, soft and warm and utterly undisturbed. Royden Pickersgill was having a terrible week. His job was to cruise the company's timber tracks, marking trees for the spring cut. But in this cold, the work was brutal and depressing. The great red and white pines, the treasure of this forest, were being destroyed before his eyes. Every few minutes a sharp crack would echo through the still air. Another giant, 100 feet tall and 2 centuries old, splitting open from the frost. The wood was ruined, full of checks and cracks that rendered it worthless for lumber. He was marking loss after loss, his axe biting into wood that was as brittle as chalk. He was working his way through a tract that bordered the settlement's northern edge when he came around a thicket of spruce and saw it. Lehtinen's foolish house. The long, dark mound sat half buried in drifted snow, looking more like a part of the earth than something built upon it. His first instinct was a grim professional curiosity. He expected to see a plume of smoke from the stovepipe, of course, but also visible signs of failure. A sag in the roofline, frost-caked seams, the subtle signs of a structure losing its battle. He saw none of that. What he saw, or rather didn't see, stopped him dead in his tracks. Through the thick, translucent skin covering the small window at the far end of the arch, he could see the faint, steady glow of an oil lamp. It was perfectly still, not a flicker, not a waver. Pickersgill knew what a lamp flame looked like in his own cabin. It danced and trembled constantly, reacting to the dozens of tiny drafts and convection currents that were the invisible signs of heat being stolen by the cold. A steady flame meant still air. Still air meant an airtight house. He stood there for a long time, the sound of another pine cracking in the distance punctuating the silence. His certainty began to unravel. Slowly, he walked towards the cabin, his boots crunching on the crystalline snow. He reached the wall. His entire experience told him what he should feel. When you approached a cabin in this cold, you could feel the cold radiating from it, a palpable wall of misery where the structure was bleeding its meager warmth into the void. He braced himself for it as he raised a bare hand. He expected to feel that biting aura. He felt nothing. Just the neutral stillness of the air. The outer bark skin was cold, yes, as cold as any tree trunk, but it wasn't radiating cold. It was inert. It was a shield. The heat was being held somewhere deep inside. He could not feel it escaping. It was a sensation so contrary to everything he knew that it felt like magic. He knocked on the rough plank door. A moment later, Toivo opened it. A wave of warm, slightly humid air, smelling of wood smoke and baking bread, washed over Pickersgill's face. It was a physical shock. He looked past Toivo, and his eyes landed on the floor just inside the door. There, on the packed earth floor, was a small, dark puddle of water. It was the undeniable proof. Pickersgill knew he had scraped pounds of caked, frozen snow from his own boots inside his own doorway that morning, and the lumps were still there, frozen solid. Here, the snow had not just been knocked off. It had melted. It had turned back into water. In a world where water turned to iron-hard ice in seconds, this was impossible. He looked at Toivo, the quiet Finn he had mocked and pitied. He saw no triumph in the man's eyes, only a calm, questioning gaze. Pickersgill felt the foundations of his professional knowledge crack apart, just like the pines in the forest. He struggled for words, trying to frame what he was seeing. "You didn't build a shelter, Toivo," he finally managed, his voice raspy. "You built a living seed." News of Royden Pickersgill's conversion spread faster than a grass fire. When the timber cruiser, a man whose word on wood and weather was taken as gospel, began describing the Lehtinen cabin not as a death trap, but as a miracle of engineering, people listened. The story of the melted snow became a local legend overnight. It was a simple, visceral proof that no one could argue with. The true validation, however, came from a man named Silas Croft, a lumber surveyor from Carleton County. Croft was a methodical, educated man who traveled with calipers, survey charts, and a worn leather-bound cruising book where he sketched interesting structures and timber formations. Hearing the rumors, he made a special trip to the Itasca Flat in late February. He spent 2 hours with Toivo, not just looking, but measuring. He measured the temperature at the floor, at the apex, and near the walls. He noted the fuel consumption. He sketched the entire structure in cross-section, detailing the lashing points, the overlapped bark skins, and the packed moss insulation. He filled 3 pages of his book with precise drawings and notes. "This isn't a cabin," Croft declared to a small group of settlers who had gathered. "This is a thermal siphon, a heat battery. Do you realize he's using the earth as a radiator and the shell as a blanket? It's the most efficient small dwelling I've ever seen." That spring, Croft's cruising book was passed around the headquarters of the largest logging company in the region. The managers and foremen, practical men concerned with payroll and productivity, saw not a curiosity, but a solution. A warm, healthy crew was a productive crew. Sickness and the constant energy-sapping cold in the drafty camp barracks cost them money and time. The low material cost and simple construction of Toivo's design were also hugely appealing. By the autumn of 1885, the effect of Silas Croft's sketches was visible. 2 new logging camps, one on the Cloquet River and another near Grand Rapids, constructed their main barracks not as traditional log rectangles, but as long, 75-foot barrel vaults, almost identical to Toivo's design. They used teams of men to bend the great green poles and harvested birch bark by the wagon load. The innovation had spread. It had been tested, vetted, and adopted by the most pragmatic and demanding industry in the state. Toivo Lehtinen was no longer the crazy Finn. He was the man who understood the winter. The quiet genius of Toivo Lehtinen's design was that it was a century ahead of its time. What he built on that Minnesota flat in 1884 was, in essence, a perfect prototype of a modern high-performance building envelope. The principles he deployed through instinct and tradition are the very same principles that architects and builders strive for today, with advanced materials and complex calculations. The inner layer of birch bark served the exact same function as a modern polyethylene vapor barrier or an advanced smart membrane like Tyvek or Siga Majpel. Its job was to stop interior moisture from infiltrating the insulation, thus preserving the insulation's R value. Today, builders go to extraordinary lengths to create this airtight, vapor-tight layer, using special tapes and sealants. Toivo did it with tree bark and pine pitch. The thick, continuous blanket of sphagnum moss is the direct ancestor of modern exterior insulation strategies. Today, high-performance builders wrap houses in thick layers of rigid foam or mineral wool, creating a thermal blanket that eliminates thermal bridging, the way heat escapes through the wood studs of a conventional wall. Toivo's seamless moss layer with no studs or rafters to interrupt it was a perfect thermal break. He had created a structure with a truly continuous insulating layer, something that is still the gold standard in building science. The arch shape itself anticipated modern ideas about structural efficiency and resilience. Architects today use arches and domes to create strong, light structures that can withstand extreme loads from wind and snow. The monolithic, shell-like nature of Toivo's cabin made it incredibly robust, able to flex and shift where a rigid, jointed structure would crack and fail. He had built what we would now call a resilient structure, perfectly adapted to its harsh climate. He didn't have the vocabulary of building science, but he had a perfect, intuitive grasp of the underlying physics. There is a simple, profound poetry in Toivo Lehtinen's solution. He looked at the forest not as a collection of lumber to be cut and joined, but as a living system full of answers. The very thing he was fighting, the brutal Minnesota winter, was the same force the trees had been successfully fighting for millennia. His final insight, the one that separated him from every other builder, was one of elegant transference. The bark that kept the living tree dry kept the family dry. One skin served two lives. The birch tree's defense against moisture, its waterproof, waxy sheath, was not something to be stripped away and discarded. It was the most important part. It was the secret. The tree survived by keeping its vital core protected from the ravages of water and ice, sealed within a perfect membrane. Toivo understood that his family was no different. They, too, were a vital core that needed to be shielded from that same external threat. He did not impose a foreign geometry on the landscape. He borrowed one. He took the skin of one living thing to create a new skin for his own family. The long, low arch looked at home in the forest because it was of the forest. It was a shelter that learned from the sheltered. In an age of brute force, of bigger fires and thicker walls, Toivo's approach was one of quiet intelligence. He saw that nature had already solved the problem. His only task was to listen to the answer and replicate it with reverence and skill. The mockery he endured lasted for a season. The validation, built of bark and moss and wisdom, would last a lifetime. Thank you for joining us for this story of frontier ingenuity. If you found the science behind Toivo's cabin as fascinating as his story, please hit the like button and share this video with someone who would appreciate it. Subscribing ensures you won't miss our next exploration into the lost arts of survival and building. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. What modern problem do you think could be solved by looking more closely at a solution from nature? Disclaimer: this video presents historically inspired reconstructions for educational and storytelling purposes. The characters, names, and specific events depicted are fictional, but the building techniques and scientific principles are based on real historical practices. The application of any building technique in a modern context should be done in accordance with current building codes, safety guidelines, and local regulations. This content does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.